Hello, Tadeo.
Nania.
We have lots of questions from our viewers and
All right.
lots of questions about Atlantis, which is great.
All right.
So, first question. If Atlantis had such prominence in ancient times, why haven't we discovered any remnants of Atlantis at all in such things as coins or graves or flags?
All right. Well, number one, you must understand the level of devastation that occurred upon the cometary strike. And secondly, Atlantis broke apart in different phases over a long period of time. Thus, there wasn't necessarily as much in the third destruction as there was in the previous two destructions to remain to be found. But you can still find Atlantean artifacts and the results of Atlantean influence around the world in different temples and stone structures that many Atlanteans guided the building of to preserve their knowledge, such as the Great Pyramid of Giza. There are other artifacts that will be found that were buried, and in time you will come to know more of the history of Atlantis. But you must understand and realize the level of devastation that occurred upon the cometary strike and the level of devastation that was created by the resulting tsunami when the comet landed in the Atlantic Ocean. Many things are buried under the sea floor at this point.
Okay, and can you talk about the preparations that were made by those that anticipated the collapse of Atlantis, if any? What artifacts, knowledge, etc., were they determined to preserve and why? Several questions here. What is the role of Egypt in preserving the Atlantean lineage? And were the Atlanteans aware of Sasquatch? And if so, how did they interact?
Well, as we have just said, many edifices were constructed under the guidance of Atlanteans, such as the Great Pyramid of Giza, to preserve the knowledge for future generations so that the knowledge would not be lost, so that humans could rebuild, could regain the position that the Atlanteans held in their height, in their prime. So again, as many of you are discovering, there is information encoded into such structures as the pyramid and other temples and pyramids around the planet. The Atlanteans prepared by creating these bits of information that they would disperse to different locations around the world by ship and guide civilizations to encode the information in some structures. Pyramids in Central America, pyramids in Egypt, pyramids in other places around the world, and other forms of temple. Again, this preparation was done before the destruction, before the third destruction of Atlantis, in that sense, the final destruction. For it was known for some time by the appearance of the comet in the sky and those that had the ability to determine such things that the comet would strike the earth and destruction would ensue. So there was a time of preparation, and therefore many Atlanteans chose to leave and be the ones who would guide others and preserve that knowledge around the planet.
The Aztecs were...
One moment. With regard to the idea of Sasquatch, a few Atlanteans were aware of the existence of Sasquatch, but the interactions between later Atlanteans and Sasquatch were exceedingly rare, almost to the point of non-existence. Very early in the Atlantean history, many thousands upon thousands of years ago, more Atlanteans, or those that would become Atlanteans, knew of Sasquatch and interacted with them from time to time, though it was never absolutely a prominent relationship. And upon the ensuing destruction of Atlantis, the Sasquatch, being slipwalkers who could go into other dimensions, collectively shifted into a dimension where they would not be affected by the devastation caused by the cometary impact. And only after things had settled down, many years later, after the impact, did the Sasquatch return to your particular reality, time frame, to continue their existence, even though they still retain the idea of slipwalking.
Can you tell me what was the size of Atlantis?
Well, again, over time, it diminished because there were various forms of breakup, natural disasters, and therefore, the idea of the landmass itself was several 100,000 square miles, as you count space, but diminished over time. The idea of the influence of the empire, however, was quite large and extended into North Central South America, into Africa, and into the Mediterranean and Europe, and even into the Asian subcontinent as you explain these things. So the influence was great and was quite global. The land masses themselves, as they diminished, went from several 100,000 square miles to only a few thousand square miles in the end.
And during that time, well, it was actually 1,000 years or more that Atlantis was prominent.
Oh, several thousand years. You must understand that the final devastation, the third phase of Atlantis itself, even was a few thousand years. But it goes back about 20 to 50,000 years, 20,000, 30,000 years ago being its prime, its height.
And there were other civilizations on the planet at that time also.
Well, there was still remnants of Lemuria, but there were other civilizations in different places. Again, remember that Atlantis was created by a migration from Lemuria across the North, Central, and South American continents, creating what you now refer to as the Indian civilizations, American Indian civilizations, that ultimately reached Atlantean shores and created the Atlantean Empire, which is why the look of Atlanteans ultimately was very mixed, but at first was mostly what you now recognize as indigenous cultures of the Americas. And the architecture was more similar to what you call Aztecan architecture rather than the idea of European or Grecian architecture. Later on, there were colonies such as the Minoan civilization, but it became far removed from the original early Atlantean style, took on some of the European styles, and eventually some of the European styles made their way into the later period of Atlantis, which is why there is some confusion about exactly what Atlantean architecture looked like. You have to realize that over thousands of years, there was a lot of adoption of different architectural styles, different cultural ideas that blended in to the later Atlantean culture. But for the most part, over most of the duration of its history, you would recognize it as more Aztecan looking than European or Grecian looking.
And it was much farther developed than any of the other civilizations on the planet at that time?
There were a few that were also equally developed in Tibet and a few other locations. But it was one of the high prominent civilizations at the time and definitely reached a peak of understanding, even though its technology was different than yours at this stage. Some things may have been similar, but some things were also quite different.
Some concept art leaked for the Atlantean characters for the upcoming Black Panther 2 film. How close is the wardrobe in those leaked images to actual Atlantean dress?
There are some similarities, but what is being represented in what you're referring to is far more flamboyant, although there were a few ceremonial things similar to what you now recognize again as Aztecan garb that did reach that level of ceremonial pomposity. But this was rare in Atlantean times. There are a few minor elements in what you're referring to that are similar to Atlantean garb, but for the most part, most of it is too far, too fictionalized, too aggrandized.
Did the Atlanteans have nuclear weapons?
They understood a form of nuclear power, but they did not have nuclear weapons as you understand them. They had a different way of understanding the idea of nuclear forces and used them in different ways, but it was a rare thing, very rare in Atlantean times, to utilize that power. The idea of vibration and resonance with respect to different elements and crystals was more common in Atlantean times. It is the resonance, the vibrational frequencies, that allowed them to discover certain forces that you would recognize today as nuclear forces in nature, but they didn't really use them in the way that you think, in the way that you're used to thinking of nuclear weapons in your modern day and age. There were similar nuclear weapons at different places on the planet in times past that were used by other civilizations, especially in the Indian subcontinent. But this was a different track than the idea of the Atlantean technology.
And is the Minoan linear A script a derivative of Atlantean writing systems?
It is a derivative, yes. It is not exact, but it is a derivative. Things change over time, and certain figures in the linear A Minoan script may be recognizable in ancient Atlantean script, but some things have changed as language does over time. But yes, it is a derivative. It is an offshoot.
Okay, and is there any hints you can give us about deciphering these texts?
No. You have people that are working on this, and we will leave them to their tasks, according to the timeline in which they will discover what needs to be discovered by the time you actually start discovering Atlantean script, so that you will have some clue and some key as to deciphering some ancient texts. So we will leave them to their devices and their timeline at this moment.
Okay. And this question is about the history of Atlantis as discussed by Lazarus.
Yes.
He says there were 3 distinct civilizations that existed in different time spans that lasted several thousand years each.
Yes.
The first began around 65,000 years ago. Each one rose to a peak, began to deteriorate, and then experienced a catastrophic end. The last one being destroyed around 12,800 years ago. Does that fit the chronology that you've discussed, or were you only describing the third civilization?
It does fit the chronology. Generally, as we have just said, there were 3 phases, which is what Lazarus is referring to as 3 different civilizations. The idea is that the timeline is relatively accurate and does conform to what we were talking about, although most of what we have discussed about Atlantis involves primarily the second and third phases.
Was Noah from the Bible an Atlantean?
Yes.
And who was it that gave him the instructions to build the ark?
Extraterrestrials.
So interesting. Atlantean gene concentration. Is there a region, country, city that has a population that is mostly Atlantean genetics?
Aztec and Basque